I wanted to start with this slide, which shows an advertisement for Domino Sugar from the 1930s, and one of the countless anti-sugar memes that you can find on the internet these days. Not because I want to illustrate a kind of progression from some sort of general public or cultural acceptance of sugar to a belief that sugar is, like, this isn't a linear story from sugar is good to sugar is 8 times as addictive as cocaine, but more that I want to point out that the attitudes towards sugar and sweetness and different forms of sugar and sweetness have always been ambivalent. That you can find in the period of this happy advertisement critiques of sugar and other non-nutritive sweeteners, just as now you can find a sort of plethora of common wisdom, popular science, pseudoscience about the relative virtues of different forms, different opportunities for sweetness in the diet. So there's no linear cultural story, right? Culture always has a potential for many different responses. So the story I'm going to tell today is kind of this capsule history that takes place in, since the middle of the 19th century, basically sweetness, a cultural history of sweetness in an age of abundant opportunities for consuming it. It's well established that the consumption of added sugars began to increase dramatically in the mid-19th century with the industrial production of commodity sucrose sugar. But it wasn't just about sucrose sugar from sugarcane. Multiple other forms of sweetness began to become present in the diet. And basically, one of the consequences of the industrialization of food, or the development of a large-scale commercial market for food, is that it raised novel questions for citizen eaters, for governments, for businesses about public health, and responsibility for public health. Basically, when you have choices to make about what food to eat, then you start having a new series of questions about what makes food good to eat, what should we eat, what should we feed the people we care for, who can be trusted, what can be trusted. And one of the kind of characteristics of food in industrial age is that people started, because of the way that food was produced, people started doubting the evidence of their senses, right? That the source of sweetness might not be legitimate. The source of flavor might not be legitimate. There might be something fraudulent about it. And this is the context of my broader project about the history of synthetic flavors and flavor science. And I also want to put it in this framework, kind of challenging this framework of nutritionism, which is a term coined by the Australian sociologist and historian Georgie Skrinis. Basically, he defines nutritionism to kind of critically describe the ideology of valuing food primarily in terms of its chemical components, to the exclusion of other factors such as production methods, culinary tradition, etc. This has been a very influential way of thinking about the problem of food, both among academics in food studies and also among popularizers like Michael Pollan. So basically, the argument is that nutritional science and nutritional advice has focused too much on individual compounds in food, right? Thinking of one protein the same as another, or seeing butter only in terms of saturated fat content, that it's missed the bigger patterns. And I think it's an interesting approach. I think that there's a lot of limitations in it. One is that that it basically makes no room for the way that sensory properties can be interpreted, or sensory qualities are interpreted by eaters themselves. So to give like a very quick overview of sugar history, prior to modernity, right, prior to industrialization, prior to the 19th century, it was rare, it was expensive. Sugar was used in therapeutic contexts and medicines. It was a seasoning in basically prior to 1650, it was seen as kind of a seasoning in every part of the meal. There was no separate dessert course. Sugar was used in every dish, kind of as a seasoning, but not to great extent. When sugar started increasing in availability, you get, and also with changes in sort of theories about medicine, you get the emergence of dessert as a fine art in its own right, as well as these kinds of decorative uses of sugar, like these very elaborate sugar sculptures that used to be the centerpieces of banquets. This is basically the story that I was telling a little bit before about the industrialization of sugar production, right, which is connected to so much global history, the history of colonialization, the history of slavery, the history of the development of different markets, right, the places where you produce sugar, the places where you refine it, and to this greater, this chart that shows shows this rising line of U.S. sugar consumption. But it's not enough simply to say, oh, people were eating more sugar, right? Sugar has to find a place in the diet and has to find, it creates its own kind of cultures. Sorry, I need to open my iPad again. So in order to increase consumption, there have to be new kinds of opportunities and new kinds of forms and new kinds of social rituals for eating sugar. So here we have an image from Mrs. Beaton's cooking manual, which was one of the, or household manual, which was one of the most popular kind of household advice manuals in the 19th century. That's the thing on the top, right? So sugar is kind of associated with this feminine, domestic labor, these opportunities for kind of showcasing one's skill, and also with all kinds of new industrial technologies for producing new kinds of food, whether cotton candy, as you see in the lower corner there, or Necco wafers, or things like soda fountains and ice cream fountains. So basically, it's not just that people are eating spoonfuls of sugar, they're eating sugar in different forms, in different kinds of foods, some of which might be entirely novel to the diet. And these things are correlated with different kinds of cultural and social values and rituals. The distinction, for instance, the distinction of the kind of culture of childhood or childhood development as a specific stage of human development, and that children have a sort of are not just seen as miniature adults that are being trained to work in factories, but that they have a different kind of life and deserve a different kind of pleasure. At the same time, sugar is always seen as containing these hidden dangers. The overconsumption of sugar, the overindulgence in sugar is also warned against. So mothers, feed your kids cakes, but make sure that they don't eat too many of them because they might become criminals or alcoholics or radical anarchists throwing bombs, essentially. At the same time that sugar is increasing, that the amount of sugar that people are eating and the forms that people are eating sugar are increasing in the United States and elsewhere, saccharin, this kind of synthetic sweetener, also comes on the market. There's one of those great stories about the discovery of saccharin, the kind of like experimental laboratory accidental discovery where Konstantin Fahlberg, who was a Russian chemist who was working in the kind of tinkering in the lab of Ira Remsen at Johns Hopkins, who was the founder of the chemistry department of chemistry as a field at Johns Hopkins, with different kinds of sulfonamides. He goes home, picks up a roll, like a bread roll, with his hands, and it tastes really sweet. And he asks his serving woman, "Have you put sugar in this roll?" And she says, "No." And then he has this aha moment, and he realizes it must be some residue from the lab. So he runs back and he starts tasting everything he made that day, which was a very legitimate form of chemical research, and comes upon the substance benzoic sulfonide. And this is in 1878. And then a few years later, in the 1880s, comes up with a method for producing it synthetically at scale. And he essentially establishes it. He sees it not in terms of its non-nutritive properties, but as a cheaper substitute for sweetener, for sugar. In foods, something that might also have preservative values. So the price of sugar is a natural product, right? There's also that's produced only in certain places. This is also a time when beet sugar production is starting to be invested in the United States in the 1880s in order to kind of secure a national sugar supply that isn't dependent upon different kinds of national or international upheaval, right? Or storms or other production or other conditions that might cause prices to raise, or tariffs, things like that, right? So saccharin is kind of a cheaper and more reliable supply of sweetness in foods. Then somewhat later in the 19th century, its non-nutritive, non-caloric status is identified, and it's also used as kind of a special dietetic food for diabetics. The question of its safety comes into play with Harvey Wiley, who many of you might know as the founder of as the head of the Bureau of Chemistry, the figure who was chiefly responsible for putting forward the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is kind of the landmark progressive regulatory legislation in the United States. He has this thing called the Poison Squad, where there's like a dozen like strong and vital young men, and he feeds them all kinds of food additives and sees what happens to them in order to determine their safety. He takes a stance. His background is as a sugar chemist and beet sugar, and so he takes a strong stance against saccharin, not because he finds any evidence necessarily of its lack of safety, but because he sees it as an adulterant. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 defined adulteration in part as substituting a thing of value in food for something less valuable. So the fact that saccharin had no food value, no nutritive value, was seen as evidence of its lack of value. The very thing, its lack of calories, that we consider an important feature of it now was back then kind of a bug, at least in the eyes of the FDA or the precursor to the FDA, the Bureau of Chemistry. Famously, Teddy Roosevelt, who was struggling with his weight, was being prescribed saccharin by his doctor. Wiley approaches him to petition for banning saccharin. Teddy Roosevelt gets really annoyed and says, my doctor gives it to me every day. Only an idiot would think that saccharin was harmful. But it does get defined under the terms of the law as it's not banned, but it's defined as an adulterant, and it has to be identified in foods. Which doesn't mean that people don't eat it. When sugar prices spiked during the First World War and later during the Second World War, people turn to saccharin, which is available as a special dietary food. So people are seeing it or adopting it as a substitute for sugar in times of shortage. But there's also, I think, in culture at large prior to the Second World War, the belief that sweetness must legitimately be connected to energetic value, to calories, right? So saccharin might stand in as sweetness during times when sugar isn't available, but real, like legitimate sweetness, legitimate sugar has to have calories, right? It's food for work. Or in the next slide, energy when you need it, right? And these are also advertisements for Baby Ruth candy that feature a new kind of sugar that is on the market, dextrose, that's being made from corn, because beet sugar and cane sugar are in short supply and rationed. So there's this kind of proliferation of different sources of nutritive sweetness that goes along with the kind of like expansion and establishment of the role of sweetness in the diet. And this idea that I think was widely accepted that, you know, the body is an engine, and you need to replenish your energy supplies, and nothing better Baby Ruth candy is the ideal perk-up fuel. Its food energy helps to carry a job through the finish, whether it's fighting a war or riding your bike to deliver papers. After the war, things start to change, the picture starts to change a little bit. There's this problem that emerges, the belly of prosperity. As public health authorities start, and regulatory authorities start looking at the relationship between diet and chronic health issues, particularly heart disease, but also this kind of new phenomenon of overweight or you know, what becomes the obesity epidemic. Different kinds of foods, especially caloric foods like sugar, are implicated in this crisis, right? And so you see, this is from Life magazine, 1954. Despite claims, willpower is the only cure. So it's this idea that in order to remedy this chronic health problem that stems from your diet, the only thing that you can do is eat less food. And I kind of love this photograph of this, which kind of illustrates to me the photograph on the right. Sorry, I don't know my right from left, that illustrates to me the irony of this, right? This woman looking resentfully at this like thin and gorgeous glamazon who is like enjoying her entire milkshake, right? Kind of points to the thing that we all now know, that you can, you know, that it's that people, that it's not simply about denying yourself or changing your diet, that other factors are at play in your body weight. Luckily for the increasingly anxious, overweight people of the United States, a new sugar-like sweetener comes on the market, sodium cyclamate, marketed by Abbott Laboratories under the name Sucralil. And there's other kind of variants of this, calcium cyclamate, which I think is being made by DuPont. But essentially, it's approved by the FDA in 1951. It's sort of the first explicitly where saccharin came on the market and had this kind of belief, you know, this under the cloud that it might be a sort of adulterant. Sucralil is and without the and as a cheaper sugar substitute, Sucralil is explicitly marketed as a non-nutritive or a low caloric sweetener. And Abbott works closely with food manufacturers to help them incorporate this substance into their foods. And promise of sucral, right, is this. You can save a lot of calories by sweetening with sucral, and you can't taste the difference. So this is kind of this, in a way, this radical change, or and this becomes widely accepted, right? This idea that you can have diet food, but you don't need to suffer. That you can diet and you can still have your pleasures. You don't have to eat special food. So at that point, special dietary food was segregated from other foods. There was a kind of harder division between food and drugs. There was a kind of consensus at the FDA that, if people wanted to try special diets, that they should do so under the advice of doctors. Sucral is one of the substances that starts to change that. In response, the sugar industry, the Sugar Information Council, starts publishing and widely publishing a series of ads showing that sugar itself can be a diet food too, or that sugar doesn't necessarily lead to getting fat. And some of these things, these are very interesting to me because they kind of mobilize the science of taste and the science of preference. And in particular, I think one of the things that they do is they kind of say that sugar isn't just about, that losing weight isn't just about calorie counting, right? So where sugar also happens to be low calorie, just 18 calories, like who knew, right? That sugar is doing more than just providing this quanta of caloric energy. It's also affecting your perception of satiety. It's helping you switch off your appetite by affecting your perception of the quantity of food that you've eaten. So there's this greater penetration into the public of this idea that that when you're dieting or when you're choosing what foods are good to eat, that it's more than just calories. You have to think about the way that you perceive your total diet. It becomes, in essence, more complicated. Then catastrophe for a lot of manufacturers that were using cyclamates. FDA ordered a total cyclamate ban after research that has since been called into question about its safety. This also has to do with the Delaney Clause to the 1958 Food Additives Amendment that kind of instituted a total prohibition against any additive in the food supply that was shown to have carcinogenic effects at any level in animals or humans. And this new category of diet products kind of scrambles to try to find ways to give people what they want, these lower calorie pleasures, without the use of cyclamates. Then, later in the 70s, 1977, the FDA tries to strike again and announces in 77 that saccharin will no longer, under the same grounds, Delaney Clause grounds, that saccharin will no longer be allowed. And cyclamates kind of vanished without much of a peep from the public. Saccharin, people got pissed. The FDA got more than 1 million letters, right? And some of it was certainly organized by industry, but a lot of it wasn't. People were using saccharin as substitutes for sugar. They saw it as a necessary part of their diets, and they thought that it helped them lose weight. But I think this says something more than that. It says that, whereas earlier in the 20th century, especially around the time of Wiley and even kind of after the Second World War, people trusted government and trusted regulatory authorities to have their best interests at heart. I think the response to the saccharin ban is this very strong measure of the lack of trust that people are starting to feel towards the government, right? And towards government action, specifically on things to protect their health and on government statements about what is and isn't good for them. I think that it also has to do with this kind of, there's a great book called Empty Pleasures by Carolyn de la Pena about artificial sweeteners, a history of artificial sweeteners, and she looks at a bunch of these letters that the FDA got, and a bunch of them, and there are certain themes that emerge. One of them is people insisting to the FDA that we're not rats. Like, you're just basing this on studies with rats, and they're doubting the kind of validity of that research. And another is everything causes cancer. So, just let me have this thing that I like. I'm gonna get cancer, like this kind of fatigue about the kind of the perceived toxicity of the modern world, which leads not just to demanding this commercial product, but also just resisting the authority of scientific experts. Sugar also becomes a suspect substance in the 70s under the guise of another public health crisis, right? The increased concern with drug addiction, the war on drugs, right? So these two very influential books, Pure, White, and Deadly, which I think was published in 1972, which compares sugar to like heroin and cocaine, and also William Duffy's Sugar Blues, where he describes himself as a recovered sugar junkie. There's a crazy backstory with him. He married Gloria Swanson, the silent film actress, who kind of got him on this, who helped him enter into sugar detox and remake himself as a handsome man rather than a kind of drudge who worked at the New York Post. But both of these books present sugar as something that has a perceptual effect on the brain that you can become addicted to. But how does this affect, how does this affect popular consumption of these substances? Not very, in a certain sense, not very much. People still are eating more sugar in the 80s. They're also consuming more artificial sweeteners. 1980s are kind of the decade of diet sodas. Between 1975 and 84, the consumption of artificial sweeteners in the US increased by 150%. But things like diet soda are seen as, they're no longer special diet food. They're no longer even really for people on a diet. They're a thing that you would consume as part of general overall healthiness, right? So a lot of these ads for Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, Crystal Light show like women doing aerobics. They're not necessarily on diet. They're just making healthy, lower calorie choices throughout their life. To conclude, where does this leave us today? There is an explosion, I think, since the beginning of the 21st century of new kinds of sweetening, I call them sweetening technologies, but all of these different ways that people can sweeten their foods commercially or on labels. You see things like evaporated cane juice, right? And there's just a kind of circulating with the internet and with social media, and with this kind of further erosion of trust in different kinds of authority. There's all of this circulating lore about what works for people, or what the best sweetener is, what you should use, what's healthy and what's not, with different things, with different substances having different kinds of advocates, and different kinds of sweetening substances even claiming other benefits, right? Sort of increasing mental focus, energy without a crash. At the same time, I think that there's also a widespread or not widespread, but definitely growing distrust of sweetness in general. So this idea that sugar or sweetness is an addictive substance, the core of this recommendation that people should reduce sweetness in their diets entirely kind of has this popular cultural correlate that you have to detox from sugar, you have to quit sugar in this deliberate way. You have to purify your body of the desire for sweetness. And this doubt that sweet things are good for you. So in conclusion, I think there's no clear kind of cultural belief about these substances. There's just, as more substances that produce sweetness have increased on the market, more narratives about good and bad have also proliferated. And many of these have longer historical and social roots, which I think have to be addressed and taken into consideration as well whenever you, in order for scientific and fact-based recommendations to be understood, to be adopted, and to be taken seriously. So I think I have like a minute or so for questions. Thank you.